Hello, it's Kim here, and I'm sitting in my yurt, and I know the light isn't brilliant, but I'm going to tell a story where I don't think it really matters, because we're going to maybe go into a bit of a relaxing, listening, reflecting, remembering space. And the reason there's many reasons I want to tell this story, especially in this yurt, because it relates to this yurt in that it starts on an April evening in 2005 when I had just given birth to my last child, a daughter. Previously, 2 Aprils ago, before that, I'd had a son, so I'd completed my pigeon pair, a Sussex pigeon pair we call that, one of each. And I can remember after the birth, after the delivery, sitting there waiting for the afterbirth, which was a bit tedious that time, and my husband sitting by the fire, and the 2 midwives, Pat Ailyard and Karen Bathurst. If you ever get to hear this story, I remember you and thank you. You were absolutely the best of midwives. You knew with how to do everything with utter spaciousness and integrity, the best of midwives. And I remember you laughing at Caitlin coming out and going, "Oh, look at those shoulders," and then you confessed that you were both Taurians, and my daughter was a Taurian by the date of her birth. So anyway, imagine it was a lovely April evening. The apple blossom was out, the daffodils were just going over, and the sun was just going down as I re-entered the house holding my daughter and went into the lounge where my mum had been babysitting my younger son. And she said, "Oh, there you are. I've been wondering where you are. Now come on, you must be tired, let me take her and sit down." And so I did what I was told. I gave her the baby and sat down and felt a little bit, unsettled, as I sometimes could by that tone of voice. But as I sat there and watched my mum looking at her latest grandchild, I saw something change, and I saw something soften in her that was beyond words. And to understand that, we have to go back to a summer when there was a girl who was going to turn 5 in September, and in September she was going to start school, and she was so excited about that. She had a much older brother, and she really wanted to catch him up and go to school and learn things. So she was she didn't never really understand why she was taken by her neighbour, who she didn't know very well, on a train all the way down to Penzance to go and stay with a young couple called Joseph Brenton and Agnes, who was pregnant. And he was a butcher, one of a family chain of butchers in Penzance, and they had farms. And she can remember falling in love with the beaches where there were these romantic shipwrecks, and being taken to the farm and taught to scratch pigs, and she's loved pigs ever since, and the best bacon. And as for Cornish pasties, she has tasted the like never ever since. And they'd go, "Come on, little maid, you can help with the milk round," and she would ladle the milk out into people's jugs on their doorstep. But she remembers what she thinks was a Sunday in the kitchen when all the grown-ups were sitting round the table listening to the radio, and then they turned it off, and she turned to them and she said, "Well, how long does war last?" And there wasn't a reply. And that's when she knew that adults didn't know everything. However, she did return back up to London to start school. Now, she lived in SW20, Copse Hill, if any of you know it, a very fine place, which was an extraordinary place really for her parents to live, if we recall that they grew up in the East End of London, where, for example, her father would meet his own father, a cook on the tea clippers, and he'd be barefoot on the docks, or his mother having to work hanging laundry against her walls in the kitchen and do that for a job because there was a baker's next door, and all that damp gave that man chest problems for the rest of his life. So he was an engineer, and he was one of the retained professions, And so the family stayed in that house, and the Blitz and the bombings started, and one of the very first bombs fell right outside their house, and that girl can remember it hit the lamppost and blew out all the windows at the front of their house, so much so that it was all boarded up, all the wall, and one little bit of light was there at the front. And the night bombing started, and she can remember, as that child, how tired she was and how she hated being woken up and being taken down the bottom of the garden. And I remember that air raid shelter. In my time, when I visited those grandparents, it was next to the shed, which smelt of cigars, because my grandfather had lots of cigar boxes. But that air raid shelter was always a bit dark and dank, and there was often a toad sitting in the corner. But down there, that young girl would go, and she would worry about the dogs left up in the house, because her mum and dad said, look, they're animals, and if they get very frightened, we don't know how they're going to behave, that it's better they stay up in the house. Or she would worry about the rabbits banging the bottom of their hutches with their back legs in terror as the bombs fell. Or the nights where she'd be taken down the garden, and one night with her uncle they'd looked up and the sky was black, and he said, those are all Luftwaffe planes. Meschafitz, he'd say, point them out. Or other nights when it was just awash, red and orange, and her father said, that's London, that's London burning. So one by one her relatives in the East End were bombed out, and one by one they came to stay. She can remember being in the air raid shelter with her granny, sitting on the top bunk crying. She put up her hand, she held her hand, she said, don't cry, Granny, it will be all right. So we often used to ask our mother, that young girl, as me and my sister, we go, well, weren't you frightened, and how did you feel, and what was it like? And she'd go, oh look, we just dealt with it, don't be so silly, and look, there was the Battle of Britain, and me and my brother were quite excited. We'd run outside and we'd watch the dog fights over Wimbldeon Common, and my brother was collecting the shrapnel, and there was our mother going, come in. And I guess she was quite worried, the mother, about us. And she said, I was hungry, I was always hungry. I said, but you must have felt something. She said, well, I didn't like the bombing of Dresden. I always thought that was a terrible thing. You see, she would have been about 11 then. The war started when she was 5 and ended when she was 11. And I said, well, weren't you frightened? What about the doodlebugs? And she said, well, there was a doodlebug that hit a house at the bottom of the garden. And I said, well, what about the people? She said, well, I remember it, I was holding a neighbour's little grey kitten, and I was stroking it, and I was standing on the back step, and the doodlebug came, and the house blew up, and that cat ran off. And I've always worried about what happened to that grey kitten. Now that is trauma. So, coming back to that April evening when she was holding my daughter, and I saw something move, something soften. It remains with me to this day. It touches my very core, and it speaks volumes to me about the preciousness of knowing the stories of our mothers, the stories of our grandmothers, the stories of our fathers and the stories of our grandfathers, and how important it is that we listen to them and then know how to hand them on, because it's the singing backwards and forwards, the stories backwards and forwards, that helps keep the world alive and helps us remember all those ancestors who have survived before us. And it helps us in the hard times when we have to be with, or even maybe absent from being close to those whom we love, who are struggling and maybe in their dying days, that we honour the lives they have lived and the stories that they have and the stories that we will have, and how that is to be seeded through the generations. So I very much hope you enjoy, if that's the right word, this story, which actually was the story that launched me as a storyteller on the course I did back in New Zealand, in Paikakariki. If any of my cohort of students are listening, do you remember? It was the autobiographical storytelling week, and I was going, oh no, I can't do that. And Sue Hollingworth said, Kim, you're going to tell that story in front of everyone. And I did, absolutely full of terror at the time. And I can remember it was a very mixed, it was a very, people from all over the world were in that hall. And I told it, I think there were 18 of us. And there was a silence when I ended, and a drawing of breath, and then a sharing. And many of the sharings went along the lines of, well, we kind of really understand the English psyche from that can do, that carry on, that pragmatism, and the depth of heart underneath it. So let that seed all of us in these extraordinary times, that there is much we can do and will do and can be of service and bring the best from our ancestral support and the best of each other and the best for the children that are ahead of us, for it is they that we need to make sure that they have a world that is worth living in a sane, loving, compassionate way. So thanks for listening, and I hope there's a little more time where I can record some more stories here, and may there be another time where we can find a place for this yurt to rise up again in a new home for new gatherings of women and new stories. So thank you.